We all love a good mystery, right? You've got unsolved crimes, anonymous artists, figures who were just lost to history. But what if one of the greatest whodunits of all time has been hiding in plain sight, right in the middle of one of the most read books in the world? Well, today we're grabbing our detective hats and opening a 2,000-year-old cold case. The piece of evidence at the center of it all? A New Testament book called the Epistle to the Hebrews. It's this incredibly moving, powerful piece of writing, but there's just one problem. The author never signed their name, and for centuries, that little detail has sparked a massive debate. So the question is simple: who wrote it? Now, this isn't just some forgotten memo. The Epistle to the Hebrews is a theological heavyweight. I mean, it lays out this profound, detailed argument about the superiority of Christ over the Old Covenant, and it was written specifically for early Jewish Christians. Its influence has been huge, which only makes the mystery of who wrote it that much more compelling. Okay, so let's officially open the case file. To really get why this mystery has lost it for so long, and why people still care so much, we need to understand the document itself. And as we're about to see, being anonymous isn't actually all that unusual in the Bible.
But before we get to that, let's just zero in on our main piece of evidence. At its core, the Epistle to the Hebrews is basically this masterclass sermon. It's written with this incredible language and deep, deep theological insight, all aimed at a community that was really wrestling with its faith and its heritage.
And yet, it turns out Hebrews isn't the only anonymous book on the shelf. If you look at books like Job, Judges, and Joshua, we don't know who wrote them either. For the early church, what really mattered was the message. The divine authority came from the words themselves, not from the fame of the person writing them down. But of course, that doesn't stop us from wanting to solve the puzzle. And over the centuries, a whole lineup of potential authors, our suspects, if you will, has been put forward. So let's go through the main contenders and see if the evidence actually holds up. First up in the lineup, we've got Luke. You probably know him as the author of the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts. He was a smart guy, a doctor, a close associate of the Apostle Paul, and a really gifted writer. So, could he be our guy? Well, the case for Luke pretty much boils down to one thing. Some people think the Greek writing style in Hebrews feels a little like his style in the Book of Acts, but the case against him, it's way stronger. It's just really, really unlikely that a non-apostle like Luke would write with such a commanding, authoritative tone to the main church in Jerusalem. And even back in ancient times, scholars couldn't agree on that style comparison anyway. So this theory doesn't really hold much water. Okay, on to suspect number 2, Barnabas. He was a big deal in the early church, a Levite, a close friend of Paul, and a guy known as the son of encouragement. Sounds like a solid candidate. The main reason Barnabas is even on this list is because an early church father named Tertullian suggested it might be him. But that's about it. The evidence just doesn't fit. Like Luke, he wasn't an apostle. The letter also talks about being in prison and writing from Italy, neither of which line up with what we know about Barnabas' life. But honestly, the biggest strike against him might be this. Barnabas himself had been shaky on the very issues of Jewish law that the author of Hebrews argues against with such absolute rock-solid conviction. It just doesn't track. And that brings us to our final alternative suspect, a man named Apollos. Now, the book of Acts describes him as eloquent and mighty in the scriptures. He was a powerful speaker, fervent in spirit. I mean, he sounds like a perfect fit, right? You know, on paper, Apollos is a very tempting choice. The elegant, powerful style of the letter totally matches his description. But there's a fatal flaw here. It's a complete guess. There is not a single piece of ancient testimony, not one source, that ever suggested he wrote it. It's pure conjecture. And besides, all those amazing qualities, eloquent, mighty in the scriptures, they also describe our prime suspect perfectly. So, it's time to turn to the main event, the person who has been the leading candidate for centuries, the Apostle Paul. But before we build the case for Paul, we have to be honest and tackle the 2 biggest objections against him. These are the very reasons this is even a debate in the first place. All right, objection number 1, and it's a big one, the writing style. The Greek in Hebrews is just so polished. It's elegant, rhetorical, and feels very different from the raw, sometimes gritty style of Paul's other letters. Paul himself even said he was rude in speech. But the rebuttal to this is really strong. First, that rude in speech comment, it was probably a bit of sarcastic rhetoric aimed at his critics. But more importantly, think about the subject matter. The deep, complex theology in Hebrews might have just demanded a different, more elevated style of writing. The second major objection is the anonymity itself. Paul starts all his other letters by saying Paul an apostle, so why not this one? Well, there's a fascinating theory that this was actually a brilliant strategic move. See, Paul was a pretty polarizing figure for a lot of Jewish Christians at the time. So by leaving his name off, he could get them to listen. He could bypass their personal prejudices and force them to wrestle with the arguments themselves, straight from the scriptures, without any baggage attached to his name. Okay, so now that we've dealt with the big objections, let's flip the script. Let's look at the affirmative case. What clues point directly to Paul being the author of this masterpiece? This is where we start to see the real fingerprints on the evidence. And this right here, might just be the smoking gun. In another letter in the New Testament, the Apostle Peter is writing to the exact same audience, the dispersed Jewish Christians, the Hebrews, and he casually mentions that their beloved brother Paul has also written a letter to them. The timing, the audience, the context, it all points directly to Peter talking about the Epistle to the Hebrews. And on top of that direct reference, there's a really strong historical tradition. As early as the 2nd century, major church leaders, the people closest to when this letter was actually written, were attributing it to Paul. That tradition just grew and grew until, by the late 4th century, it was pretty much the consensus view, and the Council of Carthage officially listed Hebrews as one of Paul's 14 letters. The letter itself is also just packed with Paul's fingerprints. The structure, for instance, laying down all this deep theology first, then shifting to practical application, that's classic Paul. The author's expert-level knowledge of Jewish traditions and law, that perfectly fits Paul, a guy trained as a top-tier Pharisee. And then you get these little personal details, a mention of being in prison, a shout-out to his good friend Timothy, and then the closing line, "Grace be with you all," a phrase Paul himself called his unique signature in his other letters. So, after looking at the other suspects, weighing the big objections, and following all the clues, where does that leave us? What's the final verdict in this ancient case? Well, here's the bottom line. While we can never be 100% certain, the evidence pointing to Paul is just overwhelming. When you put it all on the scales, the external testimony from Peter, the strong historical tradition, and all those internal clues from the text itself, the scales tip, and they tip decisively in Paul's favor. But we should probably end with a healthy dose of humility, and it's captured perfectly in this quote from a 3rd century scholar named Origen. After looking at all the evidence he had, he basically concluded that, when it comes right down to it, God only knows for sure. It's a great reminder that some mysteries are meant to endure. And that leaves us with one last big thought to chew on. Maybe the author wanted it this way. Maybe they intended for the message to stand completely on its own so that its power wouldn't come from a famous name, but from the truth it was proclaiming. And that raises a bigger question for all of us, doesn't it? Does knowing who created something really change its impact? That's something to think about.